How to start the render of a level sequence with C++ in Unreal. Because, well, that's probably one of the most useful things to automate when setting up a render pipeline. So let's get to it. So as usual, empty header file except the little function we're going to create today, and also a little forward declaration right here at the top because I want to be able to provide the level sequence to render. So the function is start level sequence render. So we're going to start a render for the level sequence we decided. The level sequence is going to be this one right here, the level sequence. And then we'll also be able to decide the output directory, so where we want to save either the frames or the movie file that we're going to generate. And then finally a little boolean that lets us decide if we want to generate either a movie or a bunch of frames. And obviously there's a lot more settings than that you can feed to this function to configure your render, but since there's a lot of settings, I don't want to feed them all one by one, so for today I'm just going to use the default settings for pretty much everything except those little settings right here, the output directory and the render as movie, and also a few other settings here and there, but I'm going to tell you what they are. Other than that, I'm just going to use the default settings, and that's going to be good enough for our test today. So good. Now that the function is declared in the header file, it's time to jump in the CPP, and as usual we're going to start with the includes, and we have a few today. We have a little bit. So we're going to have the level sequence actor because we want to be able to render a level sequence. Then the sequencer tools, that's the class that's going to help us start the render after we are done configuring it. And then we have all 4 classes that are going to let us configure the render. So first we have the automated level sequence capture, which has pretty much all the settings that are going to be provided to the sequencer tool to render the movie. And then we have all the different protocols that we can use to render our movie. So either the image sequence protocol to render images, the video capture protocol to render a movie, and finally the audio capture protocol if you want to also render your audio. So good. All those includes are inside a bunch of different modules. So we have the level sequence, sequencer scripting editor, movie scene tools, movie scene capture, and also the AVI writer. And that include right here, the AVI writer is not actually anywhere in the documentation. I had to look for it, and actually I probably spent an hour to try to figure out why my code didn't compile, and that's because of this little guy right here. You also have to add this guy inside the build.cs file, otherwise nothing is going to compile. So here it is, it's a free gift for you, so make sure to add that inside your build.cs file, otherwise it's not going to compile. And about that, it's time to go see in there if we are missing some module, and actually we're pretty much missing all of them, so I'm just going to add them all right here. So we have the sequencer scripting editor, movie scene tools, movie scene capture, and also the weird AVI writer right here. And finally, obviously, we also need the level sequence right here that is already there. So good, these are all the modules that we're gonna need today, so make sure that they are inside the build.cs file. And now we can go back in the CPP to focus on our little function right here, which is going to be pretty long. And the first step to render a level sequence, it's actually to make sure that the level sequence we receive as input is valid. Otherwise, we cannot render it. So here I'm just going to check if it's equal to null, and if it is, I'm just going to return. I'm not going to try to render it because, well, it's not going to work if the level sequence is not valid, obviously. So good. That was actually the only check we had to do. Now we can simply start the render. And the first step to do that is to create the object that is going to let us configure the render. And that's the little object right here, the U automated level sequence capture. And that object is actually pretty much the same thing as if you simply open the render movie settings window in the editor, because that window is actually just a visual representation of everything that is inside that class right here. So by creating this object, you have access to the capture object, that's the name I gave it, and inside that capture object you have access to all the settings that are inside the movie scene setting window. So if you're missing some setting, if I forgot to include some setting in this video, you can simply go take a look at the render movie setting window, and then you'll have access to all the settings that are also available inside this little variable right here. So good. Now I have my little object, and now it's time to configure it to be able to start our render. The first thing we're going to configure is actually the level sequence we want to render. So in my capture, I'm going to set the level sequence asset using the level sequence I receive as input. The second thing that we want to set is the output directory, so where we want to save the frame on our computer. So that's what I'm going to do right here. So I'm going to create myself a directory path and then set the path of the directory using the output directory we receive as input, and then we can feed that to our capture right here. So in the capture, there's a structure called the settings, and inside the settings, you can set the directory where you want to save your files on the computer. The output directory right here is going to be set using the dir path that we just created. Good. So now the render knows which level sequence to render, where to save it, and now we just have to tell it if we want to render a movie or an image sequence, but actually that's not that easy. So if you want to render render a movie, we're going to tell the capture to use the UVideo capture protocol, which is the protocol that is used to render videos, obviously. So set image capture protocol type using the class of the UVideo capture protocol, and that's pretty much it actually. Now the capture is going to generate a movie for you. But once you did that, you can actually configure your movie. So in this case, you have access to two variables. You have the use compression to decide if we want to compress the movie or not, and then the compression quality of the movie. By default, I've set them to the same values that the editor is using by default, so it's using a compression of 75. Same setting as the editor. If you want to change them, you can obviously do it. And also, when you render a movie, you have the possibility to render the audio inside that movie. So if you want to do that, you can simply set the audio capture protocol type to be the UMaster audio sum mix capture protocol, which is telling Unreal that we want to render the audio inside our movie. But in my case, I don't have any audio in my scene, so I'm just going to use the UNull audio capture protocol, which is just going to tell Unreal that, well, I don't have any audio to render, so don't try to render the audio. Good. So that was in the case that you wanted to render a movie. But if you don't, well, you can simply tell Unreal to render images instead. But actually, it's not that simple, because when you render images instead of a movie, you have a few choices of file types you can decide from. So you can choose to render JPEGs, you can render PNGs, you can render BMP, you can render EXRs. Depending what you want, you can simply decide which protocol you want to use. In my case, I'm just going to generate the PNG. So I'm using the UImageSequence protocol underscore PNG, and that's going to render, well, PNGs. And same as the videos, you can configure the different file type that you want to render. And in my case, since I'm using the PNGs, I only have access to the compression setting, same as my video right here. So I'm just going to also set my compression setting quality to 75, same as the value that is written by default in the editor. So good. Now that the render knows what to do and where to save it on your computer, it's pretty much done actually. You can simply start the render right now and it will work, but as I said at the beginning of the video, there's a lot more settings you can configure, and I'm going to go through most of them right now just because, well, I want you to be able to find them easily if you're looking for them. So I'm just gonna scroll down a little bit right here and we're gonna take a look at all the settings. And the first batch of settings that I want to show you is actually the most important in my opinion, and it is the separate process. That setting is not always used by everybody, and actually you should, I think. Everybody should pretty much use the separate process every time they are rendering from Unreal, because, well, that's just going to make your render more stable. Because sometimes when you don't use the separate process, the renders are completely different from one render to the other. There's some light glitches, the frames are jittery, there's some weird render issues all over the place, but if you use the separate process, usually it's more stable. And it's also going to make sure that all your assets are saved properly, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility because you have the possibility to feed some extra command line argument to Unreal when it starts the render, and you can use them to configure the render a little bit more if that's what you need. Here in my case, I'm just using the default values, so I'm not closing Unreal when I start my render, and I'm feeding the no screen messages and skip compile command line argument to Unreal when it starts the render, so it's going to hide all the messages that will have appeared on screen in the case that you rendered in a non-separated process way. So if you rendered in the current instance of Unreal, if your screen messages are enabled, Unreal is just going to add them inside the render, and that's not what you want. And same thing right here, I'm just going to skip the compiling of the shaders because, well, they should already be compiled since you already have the project open. Okay, good. So that was the most important setting in my opinion, and then you have all the other settings that are available to you. So in the fMovieSync capture settings, which is the little setting variable right here, you have access to all those variables right here. So you can override the game mode, you can decide how your file name are going to be formatted, you can decide if you want to override the existing frame, if you already did a render before, what is going to be the frame rate of your render, what is going to be the resolution of your render, if you want to use a cinematic mode for your render, and etc. So you have all those settings right here inside that little structure, the fMovieSync capture settings, and then you have another batch of settings directly inside the capture object. So inside the automated level sequence capture, you have access to all those settings right here. So for example, the shot name, if you want to use a custom frame for the start frame or for the end frame, if you want to use warm up, if you want to use delays in between your frames and things like that. So you also have access to those settings right here. And the last categories of setting that we have is the burn-in options. So inside the level sequence burn-in options, you have access to, well, the burn-in. It's not much, but in my case, I'm just going to use the default burn-in to show you that it works. So this is the class of the default burn-ins that come with Unreal. So the level sequence burn-in options, I'm just going to create a new object for these options right here, and I'm going to tell them to enable themselves once we start the render and feed them to my capture. So the capture knows, okay, we want to use this little burn-in object when we start the render. So good. Obviously, if you have your own burn-in option class, you can obviously instantiate your class instead of the default one, and that's that's the object that's going to be used by the render. So good, that pretty much covers all the different settings that you have access to, and actually there's a high chance that I missed a few, so you probably want to go back inside all those classes right here, so the U movie scene capture, the F movie scene capture setting, U automated level sequence capture, or U level sequence burn-in options, and look for yourself if I missed a few settings here and there that may be useful for you. So good, these are most of the settings, and now I'm pretty sure we're ready to start the render, so I'm just gonna scroll down a little bit more, and actually we're just going to start the render like that. So asking the USequencerToolsFunctionLibrary to start the render movie. So render movie, feeding in the capture, which is going to tell it everything it needs to do to be able to start the render. And actually that's it. Right here, the last variable is just a little callback onto which you can hook yourself if you want to be notified when the render is over. But in my case, I don't really care about that for now. So I'm just going to provide an empty callback, and Unreal is going to ignore it because, well, the callback is not valid. So good, the render should start. And now we can say to the user that it was a success, and now it's time to jump in Unreal to do a few renders. So here I am in Unreal, and I've set up a little level sequence that we're going to use to test our render. So we're going to try to render this little sequence right here, my warrior working a little bit. The level sequence is right here, so 036 level sequence, and it's inside my world that I have right here. And we're going to use a user interface to be able to trigger the render as usual, and that one is super simple. You just have to provide the path of where you want to render your frames on your computer, and depending if you click on render movie or render frames, we're either going to render a movie or a bunch of frames. And in my graph we can see that we're simply calling the start level sequence render functions that we created today. The level sequence is obviously going to be the 36, and then the output directory is the one coming from the user interface, and then depending if I click on render movie or render frames, we're either going to check the render as movie or uncheck it. Good, so that's it for the user interface. Now we're going to see if it works. I'm just going to click on render movie. Unreal should start a new process because that's what I asked. I wanted to render as a separate process. So Unreal starts a new process right here, opens a new window, and it's going to load the scene, and once it's done loading the scene, it's going to render the movie for us. So here we go. Now it should have rendered a movie, and if I go take a look inside the folder where my render should be, here it is. I have my AVI file, and now if I open it, well, the warrior is walking, and I also have the burn-ins right here at the top telling me the frame number, the level sequence, the version of Unreal that I use, and all the other information I would like to display inside the burn-in. But in my case, I'm just using the default burn-in, so that's the information that comes with it. So good, that was to render a movie, but now we're gonna test if rendering frames also work. So I'm going to start the render frame, and in real time we should be able to see the frames appearing in my folder. So I'm just going to let Unreal open and render frames. Oh, actually it rendered super fast, so now I have all my frames right here. They appeared super quickly, but I can open my files. Oh, here it is. I can open my files and scrub through them using the keyboard, and here we go. We can see that I have all my little frames one by one, and then I can simply take them into a video editing software to put them together and generate a movie. So yeah, that's about it. So I guess that's gonna be it for today's video, and I'm gonna see you in the next one. Bye bye!